Okay, I'm starting the recording now.
Okay.
The first thing I wanted to talk about is your analysis of oil train insurance, which I read
Sure.
when it came out last week. Could you briefly describe what you found and its implications for oil train safety?
Yeah, so the headline finding is that oil trains are radically underinsured against the risks that they present to communities. And this is actually a fairly well-known problem among commercial insurers. But what we did is we looked at the record of oil train derailments and fires, and then based on the actual costs of some of those derailments, as well as the actual costs of other rail disasters, we were able to kind of come up with some estimates about what we might expect in a reasonable worst case scenario. And that figure is in the $3 billion, $5 billion, could be a lot more than $5 billion worth of damages. By contrast, even the biggest railroads, even BNSF, which is the nation's major hauler of crude oil, only has about $1 billion to $1.5 billion in insurance. So you can imagine, without too many mental gymnastics, a reasonable worst case scenario train derailment swamps their ability to pay for it, and then taxpayers are left on the hook for the cost not only of the cleanup, but also for rebuilding and reconstituting whatever there is behind them. That happened in Quebec. There was a railroad with about $25 million in insurance, and they initiated a $3 billion disaster. Now it's the Canadian and Quebec governments, the taxpayers there, who are paying for the cleanup costs that railroad foisted upon them.
Yes, I understand the basic point. Now, in the legislature, there were considerations of different kinds of insurance liability, but as I recall, not much was done by the legislation that passed this year.
Yes, you got that exactly right. The ultimate legislation failed to put an insurance requirement on the railroads. That was a financial responsibility provision, was an element of the early drafts of that bill, but the railroad industry was effective in inoculating themselves from the sort of requirements that most other industries and enterprises have to go forward with. If you or I drive a car, we are required to have insurance that's proportional to the risk. That's true if you operate a small business or any other number of enterprises. But if you're the railroads, you have sort of this magical penumbra where the rules don't apply to you.
Okay, thank you. That was a good analysis. I'd like your view of the new proposed oil terminal in Vancouver, the Tesoro terminal that's proposed for the largest oil terminal on the West Coast. Have you looked at the details on that?
Yes, I have. It's a fascinating one to watch. It would be, it's my understanding, that would be the largest rail unloading facility for crude oil anywhere in North America. It's probably a contender globally as well. So we're talking about 360,000 barrels per day that would be delivered by train to a site on the Columbia River. The crude oil will be stored in tanks and then transferred out with tanker vessels or tank barges. Now, Tesoro, the company that is backing that proposal, has a long list of transgressions and violations. I have actually published a report about their environmental and labor track record, and it's a pretty lousy track record. It's also, I think, interesting that firm, Tesoro, has been an active and engaged player in the political money game, both in California and Washington, bankrolling Tim Eyman initiatives, bankrolling opposition to climate policy, and doing all sorts of things to basically stymie a clean energy agenda. So it's a really clear-cut case of what happens when you invite this kind of black hat oil industry to town. Not only are they proposing an environmentally very concerning project in a large oil terminal, but they bring with them substantial amounts of money that they are prepared to spend to stymie progressive politics.
Okay, we'll be watching that particular draft environmental impact statement for the hearings that'll come up. Now, there are a number of other oil terminals proposed, or expansions actually proposed in, for example, Grace Harbor and Anacortes. And there was a hearing just this week, last weekend, this week, in fact, 3 different hearings on the Anacortes proposal.
Right.
Have you followed those hearings?
I have. I actually provided testimony to the hearing examiner when the county was deciding whether to require them to engage in a full environmental impact statement process, which they are doing now. here's what we see with the hearings around the Shell Anacortes facility, and we see at Grace Harbor, and we see in Vancouver, Washington, and we see in other places. When given the facts about these proposals, when given almost any chance at all to unpack the dimensions of these projects, the public doesn't like them. There's very little upside for communities. It's almost all downside. It's risk, it's pollution, all kinds of other negative externalities that these projects put on local communities. And so one of the things we saw with the hearings around the Anacortes facility, the Shell's expansion there, is that the overwhelming majority of people who go to these meetings are completely opposed to the project, and very well they should be, because they, in some sense, I mean, the mayor of Mukilteo, I think, and others have said this, they pose something like an existential threat to these towns. If one of those trains bound for the refinery at Anacortes derails and explodes into flame, which we've seen 10 times happen across North America, if that were to happen in one of these towns, it could be lights out for a good number of people. And that's not who we are as a region. There's no reason we have to tolerate this stuff here.
Okay, I want to switch gears a bit to coal trains, and as you know, the Longview Terminal draft environmental impact statement has been delayed, and we're not sure when the Bellingham statement might come up. Right. Have you followed the developments there, and what are your projections for these two terminals?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that folks have been cautiously optimistic that all of the coal export terminals will eventually fall away. Some folks maybe don't realize that we originally started with 6 coal export terminal proposals in Oregon and Washington. 4 of those either sort of went away by themselves or were killed off. These last 2, though, are, in my judgment, still remain serious threats. They are structurally deficient in all kinds of ways. They are a rolling ball of liabilities, and they should absolutely be opposed. But they are very real issues still in front of us right now. You pointed out that the Longview public comment period on what will be the draft environmental impact statement has been delayed yet again. Which is sort of good news for the opposition movement. It is worth pointing out that the companies behind the Longview proposal in particular are in sorry shape. There are sort of 2 players in that. One was an Australian energy firm called Amber that's basically now been swallowed whole by its creditors. The secondary player there, Arch Coal, is now staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. They just conducted a 10-to-1 reverse stock split to maintain their share price and stay listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And now the creditors are coming in, and it looks like they're going to have a judicial proceeding to divide up how they're going to pay their creditors. So they're in bad shape. It's a good indication of how weak that industry is. But there's every reason to think that those projects are still going forward, and they still deserve substantial attention and opposition. Okay,
I'm going to switch again to climate change.
Yeah.
And the governor's climate plan has been proposed as a rule, and there is some question about its validity, according to the Attorney General. Have you followed the progress of that particular rule?
I haven't followed it extremely closely. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the governor would like what many of us would like, which is an economy-wide limit on carbon emissions and a price mechanism that's attached to that to do it in a rational way. The Senate Republicans have stymied his every effort to advance anything like a sort of comprehensive and rational approach to climate policy. So he is continuing to push forward with what I think is his sort of obligation, given his values, to advance a climate policy. It does seem like there are some legal question marks around how that gets implemented. I don't know enough about how that would get sorted out to have a guess about the future. But I am encouraged that he continues to push on every lever he has available to him.
Well, of course, the rule will probably stimulate some hearings next year, and that will be an opportunity to review all the issues there.
Right.
In addition to the governor's climate plan, there are 2 possible initiatives, one of which is now underway with Carbon Law, the carbon tax, and the other is only sort of glimmer in the eye of the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. Do you see good prospects for those initiatives next year?
Well, I think we're all kind of in a wait-and-see mode. I mean, I think it is imperative that we adopt an economy-wide approach to reducing carbon emissions and do that in a way that gets us to where we need to be based on what the science is telling us. I think it's fair to say it's frustrating to most folks to see what looks like a little bit of a struggle between those two enterprises. I'm hopeful that at the end of the day, we will find a sort of unified platform that folks can get behind and support, because in my judgment, either one of those proposals is so drastically better to the status quo, which is doing nothing, that it seems like we can take advantage of the sort of public movement, the increasing public support for climate policy, and do one of those two.
Well, the question is, would the two initiatives compete on the ballot or compete for support among the voting public? Do you think there is a competitive aspect, or is it more cooperative?
Well, there could be in theory. I mean, it depends how kind of everything gets sorted out. I mean, Carbon Law would still have to, it still has to get enough signatures to qualify. It looks likely that will happen now. Then that Carbon Law is, of course, an initiative to the legislature. So the legislature has then the opportunity to either adopt it, to modify it, and put it on the ballot next to a modified version. So that's the route that would go through. The Alliance would be proposing to put an initiative directly onto the ballot. So if both of those things were to happen, you could end up in a situation where they were competing. But I think there's so many steps, so many turns left in the road there that it's entirely possible that they don't end up in a competitive situation. And I hope that's what happens.
Just to sort of wrap things up, do you have any other concerns about climate and or fossil fuel transport? Those are the two big topics we'll be discussing.
Yeah, I do. I think so. We have, for the last few years in this region, really taken a hard look at coal exports, and then we've taken a hard look at oil trains. And it's my argument that there's a third wave in the tsunami heading our way, and that is the wave of sort of light hydrocarbons. And given everything we know about the industry and the geographic pressures on getting fuel to Asia, I think it's reasonable that the next argument we'll have will be around the construction of large liquefied natural gas facilities, methanol refining, which is coming up big time. So it's a petrochemical that's used for plastics, ultimately in China. Propane by rail is coming our way, and some other projects like that. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is to help the environmental community, help the progressive community think about coal and then oil, and then this new wave, the third sort of face of this very same industry of basically natural gas and petrochemicals. Almost all of which are bound for Asia as well.
Well, we do have a sister organization in Oregon, and they're contending with the LNG terminal there.
Right.
And that could come to Washington then.
It could. The LNG sites, there are two contested sites in Oregon. There are at least a half dozen in British Columbia. Probably Washington wouldn't see an LNG facility proposed in the way that those are, but our version of that will be methanol. Methanol takes in large quantities of natural gas, then uses a reforming process to turn it into methanol, which is then taken to China as a bulk liquid, converted into a precursor to plastics. So we have that and a couple of other kissing cousin projects.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much covers all of the climate change and fossil fuel transport issues.
Sure.
And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and I look forward to your talk at the University Unitarian Church in December.
Well, thank you for taking the time. Looking forward to the talk also.
Okay, thank you.
All right.